an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Soulsmith Chapters 15, 16, and 17, and just a drop of Chapter 14, which I did not get to last episode. In these chapters, Weishi Lindon has advanced again. That shit happened really fast, and it sounds brutal. He came super close to dying. Honestly, though, it seems like it was worth it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Andrew for commissioning this episode. Andrew, I don't know if you are here in the chat, but I hope that you were able to make it. And apologies for my being late or very nearly late. So these chapters, like I said, I wanted to get back with the end of chapter 14 because I just didn't have time to cover it last time. And I had considered how to divide up this section because next episode, which will be the last episode of coverage for this book, won't be a full 50 pages. But I decided to leave it at 30 pages because I'll probably be wrapping the book and it's good to leave myself a little extra room. And if in covering the end of chapter 14 in this section, I then don't leave myself enough time to cover everything from this section by the end of it, I will still have a little room to work with in the next one. So just sometimes people will read along with my coverage and they get frustrated if they don't know what chapters I'm going to be covering. And I try and give people a heads up if I have looked ahead and figured that out. Andrew's here. Hi. Do you want to be called Andy or Andrew? I try to call you by the name in your email, but then I'm like, well, maybe he prefers Andy. He's the one who picked his username. So then I'm like, well, I should just ask. I normally use Andy. Okay, Andy it is. So we go in the end of chapter 14, the section that I missed about Jai-Long is him dealing with the Fishers. Essentially what's going on is everybody seems to agree that they do not want the Aurelius family muscling in on their shit. They all, regardless of whether they are Fisher or Sandviper or Jai clan even, they don't come into this, but I imagine all of them seem to be united on fuck Aurelius family, give me mine. And I am super duper curious about why. What is it about the Aurelius family that has everybody basically giving them the finger and trying as hard as they can to get their own shit? Is it purely that the Aurelius family is like way far more advanced than everybody else and so everyone's trying to at least catch up with them? Or is there like something personality wise? Are they incredibly overbearing or constantly fighting everybody trying to take their territory or their people or whatever? I really, really want to know who they are, what the threat is exactly, and I imagine that the reason that we come to the conclusion that we do this section is because either the Fishers or the Sandvipers are each confident that whether they find this shit, like whoever finds the spear first is irrelevant. It's who gets to keep it. And each of them seem to be as certain as the other that they are going to be the ones that walk out of that place with it and are able to hold on to it. And once we see a little bit more about how the Fisher family's like Madra tends to be used and the weapons that they have, it becomes a little bit more understandable why they are so confident, because finding shit is their jam. And they are, there's just this sort of like retraction theme that keeps going. When you think of fishing, you think of fishing lines and reeling things in. And that thematically tends to be what a lot of them are working with. I find it really interesting how these clans all have such similar Madra uses. And it makes sense, like, now that we know about how paths work, and once you are given a path, you are basically encouraged to do the same thing as all of the other people in the clan, all of your forebears, because I guess that conformity is seen as being a member. Like, you can't be part of this clan if you have a totally outlying skill that feels like it's not part of the Fisher clan or not part of the Sandviper clan. But it does, to me, really seem unbalanced, you know? Like, I understand the thought behind it in terms of simply wanting to feel like part of something with everyone else. But to me, the idea that you wouldn't vary the skill sets in your clan just seems like a real way to shoot yourself in the foot. And I suppose that because so much of the abilities in this universe depend on being taught by people who are proficient and improving on the things that they know, that the idea of following one particular path exclusively sounds like it's sort of like when you're playing a video game and you put all of your points, your leveling up points, into one skill, where you really feel, I'm making the smart choice in that I am going to become so incredibly excellent at this one thing that whether or not my skills are varied will wind up being irrelevant, because I am able to absolutely devastate everyone else with this other skill that I have honed to perfection. So I think that's the thought behind it. And when you're talking about a video game, that does tend to be the way to go. You do actually want to, like, oftentimes level up one skill and then approach every mission that you have in such a way that that skill is showcased, right? But when you're talking about actually, like, going out into the world, if you don't have a legacy behind you, if you aren't part of a clan, that isn't how you're going to want to approach things, generally speaking, you know? So I find it really interesting to see the difference between how people who live in this sort of traditional way with their clan members around them and elders and learning and the rituals of advancing, how different that is to the approach of somebody like, say, Yaren, who she was taken in by this sword sage and taught from such a young age. Her family wasn't a factor. It was what the sage decided to teach her. And what Lindon's doing now is he's attempting to, like, gain levels to the point of being nearly a god. And that is, like, we have, like, underlords, so it's not like you can't do that following the same mission as everyone else. But again, it's going to be very specialized. I just wonder what other things Lindon is going to add to his arsenal as he moves forward. How many more things are going to be within the same theme that we're seeing, and how many things are going to appear to maybe not be compatible but actually wind up being compatible? Are there going to be moments where he does something like what, like Jai Long takes he gets a gold sign because of a remnant that was not the remnant that he had been intended to match with. He was supposed to take a remnant from one of the elders of his clan, and all of the elders were stubbornly staying alive. So he didn't get the one that he was ready to take on a remnant, but he didn't get given one. And so when push came to shove, he took the remnant that was nearest to him to just use that. And will that happen to Lindon? Will something occur in which he's forced to take on an aspect of something or a path for something that wasn't really what he wanted, but it seems like that's the only option for him? You could argue that's what happens in the next section when he winds up becoming an iron by using the, is it the Path of Blood? I can't remember what it's called, but he winds up being sort of forced to take that method simply because they don't have time. You know, it's not really the same in a lot of ways because of he has such pure Madra right now that there's nothing that it could clash with. It doesn't, he is a blank slate right now. And this is really the first thing that he has done to particularly point his destiny in any direction in terms of his abilities. But if things like this continue to happen to him, that will be really interesting, because it's easy to say, okay, do this, and this, follow this particular path, go for these sorts of abilities. It is another thing to be taught in the middle of this, like, desperate, I like that word feels extreme, but it is. He is in a desperate position just as a person. He has left his clan. He is out here with the knowledge of this destruction that's coming. And it's not like he's planning to head home anytime soon, right? So that means that he isn't going to be in what I imagine as like a school-ish sort of setting, where you have very predictable leveling ups, and that means he may find himself carrying all kinds of weird abilities that nobody would expect to go together, or nobody would have recommended that go together, and yet that just sort of winds up what happens circumstantially. Anyway, I think it's really interesting once we find out a little bit more about the Fishers and how their shit works. So it's him, Jai Long, and Kral, and they are meeting with Rahan, the leader of the Fisher sect. And I love this. Rahan looks like a real fucking mook. Like, he has bare feet. He's got old clothes that are really stained. He has gray hair that it's not braided. It's not anything. It's just hanging loose, and it probably looks pretty shitty. And he has this like knife that is rusted, and just genuinely, this man, if you looked at him, does not look like anybody that you would notice or give a shit about. But Jai Long is looking at this dude and realizing how incredibly strong he is, and is trying to resist filling the silence. And this is a technique that people use in negotiations. If you are in a position where you have to negotiate with somebody, allegedly a good technique for getting the upper hand and making the other person uncomfortable is supposed to be being silent and waiting for them to make the first move, and sort of forcing them into the position where they have to speak and make their case, rather than you beginning to do that, so that it almost puts them on the defensive immediately, because you are, once you speak, going to be countering whatever they say, versus trying to set up your initial argument. There's an episode of 30 Rock in which both Liz and her boss sit there for like 10 full minutes, neither of them saying anything, because they both just read the same like technique handbook for negotiating. So let's see. So he has come to get Jai Long. It says, for the next hour, they'd stood underneath a tree as the bloody pieces in the fisher's net slowly dried. The next hour, you guys. Jai Long wondered if this patience was perhaps the secret of Rahan's advancement. The beggar chief was one of the few true golds in the entire wilds, which meant that he'd gained a complete control over the remnant in his core. I love when there's like details like this dropped in, so that we are informed as we go through the story about what things mean, rather than there being this huge info dump. Here's what true golds mean. Here's what half gold means. Or, like, I much prefer finding things out in drips and drabs if it's done well. I don't need all of the information right at the top. It's fun to have, don't get me wrong, but it's rare that feels natural when you're reading. And oftentimes it will just come across like somebody has pasted a page from a handbook into the thing. And sometimes that's how they do it. An author will be like, oh, he read in this book about such and such, and it's a huge, graph or something. And you're like, okay, yeah, I get it. His gold sign was very subtle. A stranger may not even notice the webs between his fingers. Once, true gold had seemed like the pinnacle of achievement. He'd worked himself half to death to get closer, eventually achieving high gold himself, only to discover that his particular gold sign would never go away. His face would remain hideous no matter how far he advanced. I didn't think for a moment that Jailong would be able to get rid of his gold sign at some point. And I find it really interesting that that was ever a motivation for him. And also, he says, like, oh, now I know it won't go away. And I'm like, but do you? Because we are really learning how little anybody knows about anything. So he thinks that. I'm not convinced, you know? We seem to also think that you take in a remnant and that's just the remnant that you have forever. Now, that may be true, but I only have these people's word on that. I don't have any reason necessarily to trust them. And I just wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that there is a way around that or something that can happen, you know, whether it's voluntary or not, that maybe makes those rules a little bit more wobbly than everybody thought. Fishers adopted a peculiar twist on the aspect of force. In some way that Jailong didn't understand, they could draw objects in like fishermen pulling on invisible lines. They might have some way to open the doors without manipulating the script. So, the script has slowed our progress, Jailong says. I'm confident we'll make our way inside given enough time. And this dude is like, all right, that's all well and good, but these people's fucking banners are only 3 days away, max. So you're going to really need to get on that shit. And Jailong is like, oh, fuck, because he really thought he had more time than that. And Rahan offers to buy the map off him and says, you guys don't even know how to do the shit that needs doing in order to use it. So clearly it's not useful to you. You may as well make some money off of it. He says, I'll take it, clean out the ruins under the before the Underlord gets here, leaving nothing for Jailong, much less the Sandvipers. And Jailong is like, I mean, granted, he could pay me a lot. This dude, despite looking like a goddamn disaster, is one of the richest people in the wilds. So he'd be able to pay good money for it. But Jailong is, if he has his pride, that shit is not going to fly. And he offers to share, essentially. He's like, you help us and I will distribute rewards on merit. And Rahan just is sort of like, yeah, okay. I am not surprised by this. And he says, we'll compete with honor to save face for our sects. You can't call that a competition, Jailong said, contempt in his voice. The other factions will never stand for it. Rahan was a true gold with the power to do whatever he wished, and Jailong couldn't stop him. But honor and fear for the Fisher reputation should keep the old man from pushing a mere high gold around. And this dude gets mad and says, you question my honor again, boy, and you're taking your life in your hands. I happen to have a disciple. He's high gold, and he's more than happy to stand for a traditional duel. Aren't you, Locke? And this dude, Locke, steps out. I love that Jailong is low-key like, was he just waiting there this entire time? Just chilling? I mean, that is just a really funny moment to me. And he's like, we just stood here looking at each other and not talking for an hour. And he maybe just hung out that entire time. So Jailong is kind of like, I mean, I guess this makes sense in terms of a lot of clans settle their business this way with these kinds of fights. But also, he thinks that this dude's trying to fuck with me personally. He wants me to draw a weapon and at the very least be wounded, which will be a problem for the Sandvipers as a whole. And he says, win or lose, the first fisher would get what he wanted. And if Jai Long refused, his reputation would take a hit that might be more fatal than a physical wound. Even the Sandvipers would turn on a coward. So Jai Long had foreseen that this would happen. And he gestures, and Crawl comes out from a building nearby and is like, hey, what's up? You want to fight? I hear you wanted to fight. I am here to fight. I love that this dude tries to be like, you'd risk your chief? Jai Long is low-key he knows that this dude is fully aware Jai Long is the boss. So it looks like, oh yes, we're risking our chief, isn't that? But no, not really. And that was the reason the dude tried to get Jai Long to fight in the first place. Not what happened. So Jai Long has, oh my God, why can't I keep his name in my head? Crawl, that's why. Crawl fight on his behalf. And we get to see some of this Madra thing where this kid shoots essentially like a tentacle almost out of his back that pulls him backward toward the tree up into the branches. And he says something to Crawl thanks for going easy on me. And Crawl loses his shit. He can't handle it. So he goes full on toxin, and it doesn't wind up hurting Rahan because he's such a high level that apparently it just doesn't really have much of an effect on him. But this kid dies. I'm pretty positive that he's dead, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of this. And Rahan is really pissed. He is obviously fighting to keep his temper, and he knows that he got played pretty well. But this is a fucked up thing that just happened. This dude could have let it go, and he decided to really take it to the end. And I don't know that fighting to the death was supposed to be how this shit went. I don't think so. It's not like he can actually say that because they didn't agree to that parameter. But I think it's sort of there's an understanding when they go into these sorts of competitions that death is potentially on the table, but it's not like that is a requirement for shit to be settled. And Crawl took it there, and he didn't have to. So we head out from there to chapter 15, where Lindon is still sitting locked inside that chamber with all of these creatures. It's been days now. And his legs are both broken. He has a cracked rib. One of his eyes is swollen shut. He is in a really bad way. And right now, he's just sitting here looking at that little Sylvan that he keeps feeding Madra, and he's got this thing drawn on the floor in order to prevent remnants from getting at him. But that doesn't do anything against these creatures, evidently. And it says he'd use the claws of the spider construct in his pack to cut dead matter away from the remnants that regularly attacked him. With those pieces, those bright blue shells and shimmering green limbs, he'd boxed himself in. His back was to the door, and his fortress was piled up against the stairs. He'd backed himself into a corner, which had led to a few tense moments as he had nowhere to run, but he refused to move his fortification to the top of the stairs. If the door ever opened, he wanted to be able to run through in an instant. And I love this because the more that we hear about how he handled them, the more we understand how much he's making use of his smarts rather than relying on skills that are only acquirable through Madra usage, through any sort of particular strength or that kind of ability. There's a strength of will to all of it. You know, there's a determination that he has had where he's like, okay, I'm going to fucking make it to the end of this because I say so. I have decided that's what's going to happen, and God damn it, I'm doing it. But all of it is pure, like, drive, which is what Ethan was talking about, and it makes a lot of sense. And so there's just, you know, a lot of, like, making use of the dead matter, or in the last section where he kills the monsters, like, that are initially hassling him by, like, dropping a rock on them. Things that are very practical. But when you are a person who relies so much on essentially magic for everything, you may forget that those practical options are still there because you're used to being able to reach for something supernatural all the time. And I really enjoy that. It's the sort of thing that, like, in the Dresden Files, Harry Dresden will carry a gun because he's like, I'm dealing with all kinds of creatures that are super used to wizards, throwing fire at them, you know, lightning, whatever. But they are not prepared for me to just pull a 44 out of my pocket and be like, what's up? That's kind of where I feel like Lindon's coming from a little bit. You know, he hasn't gone through martial arts training. He hasn't figured out how to sword fight. So he has a fucking baseball bat. And he's like, I'll do what I can. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Gotta do what you gotta do, man. So it says, despite the haze of agony that hung over him, he was pleased with the weeks of work. The razor-edged tension had done wonders for his advancement, since there was nothing to do here but cycle and prepare to be attacked. And the slightest moment of inattention would result in his inevitable death. So this is, again, another real moment of, like, understanding who he is. Is he sitting there pissed off at Ethan, vowing revenge for him being abandoned? Is he whining to himself about how unfair this all is? Why would anybody, how could this happen to me? No. He is sitting there going, man, I have really accomplished a lot. This has sucked, don't get me wrong, but look at all that I have done that I never would have thought I could have done if you had talked to me a couple of weeks ago. And the thing is that his body isn't exactly prepared for advancing to iron. His Madra is apparently ready. And I'm going to read this here. He wanted to advance right now because breaking through the barrier to iron completely reforged the body. Advancing to copper had cleansed him of scrapes, cuts, and bruises, and iron was supposed to be a more thorough transformation. But if he advanced before he was ready, he would damage his own foundation. That was the only thing that held him back. If his iron body wasn't perfect, he wouldn't be guaranteed high gold, much less the heights Suriel had challenged him to reach. And I like that he has her marble sitting out, and he keeps looking at it and thinking about how she had believed that he'd be able to get there eventually, and keeping that in mind, you know, which that's sort of what I think matters to most of us. If there's somebody who knows what they're doing and they claim to see something in us that indicates we're going to be able to manage more than we think, that is what can be a big drive. Is just, you know, they know what they're doing. They have done this before and been here before. So if they say, then it must be true. So it says he needed to suffuse his body with Madra, soaking it completely, and he was at least another week away from that, probably 2, and his body was done. So this is what we wind up coming to a little bit later. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because we have a lot more of him thinking about the way that he has survived, that he doesn't have food and he doesn't really have a way to get food because he can't even walk now. And he keeps forging Madra scales and then restoring his Madra to full and then absorbing the Madra scale. So it stretches him out a little bit, which I find really interesting. You know, it's something that he hadn't really been sure would work, but as long as he restores himself to full before he does it, it's sort of like powering up a bunch of battery and then, you know, filling up the actual, like, item. Like, you have a backup battery for your cell phone and you have the actual battery within the cell phone. And he is managing to then absorb what power is in this little external chip back into himself and push forward that way. So he's talking to Yaren through the wall, because that's where he's like, through the door. That's where he is camped out. And he sees that there are sparks playing inside the script that wraps the chamber. And he asks her as this is happening, because she mentions, like, I see light in there. Is something going on? He says, have you asked Ethan, is he there by chance? And all of a sudden, Ethan speaks to him and tells him, hey, buddy, so, bad news. I'm going to have to open the door. And Lindon is delighted, of course. This is being presented as bad news, but he's like, oh my God, thank you, fucking let me out. He's so deprived of company that just hearing somebody's voice that isn't Yaren's almost makes him burst into tears. And then he says, don't worry, the power is being drawn to the top of the pyramid, so every dread beast and remnant in the ruins will follow us. And he really does come close to crying here. When they open the doors and look at him, he's just sitting there doing his best not to start sobbing, because he wants to be, you know, the grizzled survivor, you know, he wants to be the veteran. And Ethan backs away from him when he opens the door and is just basically like, oh my God, dude, you reek. Which, yeah, I didn't really think about that, but that's pretty horrifying. Like, he's in this spot. It's not like he's got to change of clothes. He doesn't have a bathroom. So, and he can't walk. So he has to be just laying there in his own filth since his legs got broken. And you just, I guess, have to deal with that. And that, I mean, having broken legs is bad enough, but that indignity on top of it is really pretty fucking embarrassing, as well as terrible to endure. So Ethan looks at Lindon and says, it's been hard on you. Was it worth it? And Lindon says these 2 weeks had been, he says, first to Ethan, gratitude. This one cannot repay the favor. And then it says, these 2 weeks had been the worst in Lindon's life, but half a month of agony was nothing compared to a lifetime of helplessness. Now he was on the verge of iron. Iron might be nothing but a child's accomplishment out here, but his parents were only iron. He hadn't even turned 16 yet, so he'd surpass his sister. I really, really appreciated that reminder from the author, because I have sort of gotten to the point where iron, I'm just like, well, that's a really big deal for you, personally, Lindon, but it's really not a big deal to most people. And I keep forgetting that in the community that he came from, it actually is still a big deal. Like, you know, it's not just the fact that he was disabled, essentially, from when he was born. It's also that was like such a high echelon because of the elders of his community being a part of that level, that it felt out of reach, because they were so much older and more experienced than him, and they had only ever reached iron. And so it's taking a complete readjustment in perspective. And I just like that the author reminded me of that, because I had completely forgotten. So let's see. If he returned to Sacred Valley, the Way clan wouldn't just welcome him back. They'd reward him. He would be their new idol, the one they paraded in front of the other clans to show their superiority. The idea was so sweet that it almost choked him. Far more important was that he'd taken his first steps on the path Suriel had shown him. He might really surpass Gold, and Ethan had helped him. For that alone, he really did owe the yellow-haired man a debt he couldn't repay. So, at this point, Ethan's like, I'm glad to hear you say that, because we gotta push you even more. Now, you know that you could advance to iron from here. But if you did that, you would wind up shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. You would have a difficult time reaching low gold, and reaching high gold would be very close to impossible. If you ever did it, you would be really old by the time you managed it. And he says, even if you had finished, you still have reached only the most ordinary sort of iron. And he says you need a perfect iron body. And there are different ways to do that. Yaren explains that she was submerged in water. And she says that it was like, it wasn't even like just water, because it says water drilled right down into me until I thought I was dead for sure. 3 days and 3 nights I squirmed like a worm on a frying pan, breathing through a reed. Then he let me out. Steel-born body, he called it. You don't see much out of it until you're past gold, but once you hit Underlord, it's supposed to be the best iron body in the world for pure brute strength. Ethan, for his part, he got the raindrop body. He says you're supposed to be able to thread through drops in a rainstorm without getting wet, though I've never found that to be true. And Lindon asks, what do you have to do for that? And he says, play games. Catch birds as they run off, run as fast as you can, hit balls with sticks. And the two of them look at him like, are you serious? And I love this. He's like, I don't know what to tell you. Not everybody has to go through a fucking gauntlet, man. Sometimes it's just easier. I don't know. And he says, so the thing that we can do for you is give you a blood-forged iron body. The advantage is that it's way, way faster than these other methods. The disadvantage is that it hurts like a motherfucker. And it's also kind of gross. And we find out that what it is Lindon is going to have to draw this like Sandviper venom into his system, cycle it all the way through, and he's going to have to drink the blood of the viper because the blood has a protective property in it that will keep you from being damaged by it permanently as long as you cycle properly and then move forward. And what Lindon does is he gets given the usual dosage and he cycles it pretty quick. And then he's like, is that it? Really? And then he asks for more. This motherfucker is crazy. And Ethan couldn't be more delighted. He has suspected, I think, that Lindon was exactly this type of crazy and is so gratified to find out that he was right about him. Like, it's almost adorable to see how excited Ethan gets about the fact that Lindon is just doing a bring it on gesture every time that they finish one of these vipers. Eventually they get to 6. And that is when it seems like he's pushed himself too far and is about to die. 6 though. I mean, and these are full on just jamming the viper teeth into his arm to cycle up and drinking the blood straight on out of the body. We get a pretty great juxtaposition to this later, where we go to Jai Long, who is preparing the blood and venom of one of these Sandvipers really carefully. And it's not even as carefully as it's supposed to be. We find out that, like, ideally, there's this other whole ritual that's supposed to happen when you do this, but he is sort of feeling impatient because of everything that's going on, and so he's not interested in doing all of the formalities. And I love getting to see the difference between what the Sandvipers normally do and what it is that Lindon does. Like, there's a reason why later on, when Krall stabs him, Krall is so confident that Lindon is dead because Lindon is so much more apparently resistant to the toxin now than an iron from the Sandviper clan would be. And that's my understanding. I may be wrong about this, but I get the impression Krall underestimated Lindon's strength because Lindon put himself through so much more hell before he advanced to iron. So Krall stabs him and then strolls the fuck away and really thinks that he did some shit. And it's not until Ethan is like, buddy, I don't know how to tell you this, but that motherfucker is still alive over there, that he turns around and is like, oh shit. And it is a really satisfying moment. It's probably the first time that anybody has truly underestimated Lindon in terms of sheer... I don't even know what the word is. Like, durability is the best I can think of, because they have underestimated him a ton in terms of what he's willing to do. Lindon isn't worried about, like, playing by the rules most of the time. He is fine with cutting corners and doing whatever it is that he needs to do to win, considering all of the disadvantages that he has. But this is just a straight up, I thought that you were dead and you're not moment. And I am just so here for this. So eventually Lindon, like I said, he has done 5. And his body wasn't moving much anymore, as he'd run out of energy sometime in the night. When he twitched, it was like lightning moving through dead flesh more than any conscious attempt at motion, and his skin was all but invisible beneath swollen black veins. Ugh. So gross. Sandviper blood ran from his teeth as his own blood ran from his ears, the corners of his eyes, and even sweated through his pores. He lasted more than a day, which had left even Ethan astonished. His standards were high. Too high, really. But this copper had still surprised him. Meanwhile, Yaren is over here fighting dread beasts like a madwoman. And I can only imagine that this is going to help her level up to something eventually as well. But we know there is a much greater distance between her level and the next versus what Lindon's doing here, you know. So she sees Lindon from far away and mistakenly thinks that he is dead and attacks Ethan, which Ethan is completely prepared for and sidesteps easily. And she says, you buried him. And Ethan says, he asked me to. And I love this so much. She's like, did he really? And then Lindon opens his eyes and says, one more. And she's like, oh my God, he's dead ass serious. He did ask him to do this. She just couldn't believe it, which I don't blame her for, you know. I think this is a great moment in terms of character revelation for Yaren as well, because I think Yaren also underestimates Lindon. He is soft in a lot of the ways that she has said. She's been making valid points, but she seems to believe that because he is soft, he isn't going to be willing to do what needs doing. She seems to think he just doesn't have what it takes, maybe. And I really like getting to see her be surprised at the lengths that he's willing to go to and realizing he is absolutely prepared to put himself through whatever he needs to get where he wants to go. And I just think that's going to really earn her respect even more and be valuable down the line. So this is when Ethan says, all right, so here's the thing. I just gave him that last one. He is dying now. My bad. But we can transform him to iron right now. The truth is, though, that we may have waited a little bit too long. And even if we do this, he'll be brain dead by the time it's finished. And Yaren just snatches that shit from him, because it turns out that there's like a crystal coin that I think is pure Madra, if I'm not mistaken. And she snatches it from him and forces it down Lindon's throat. And it turns out she doesn't even have the strength to do it. She is so exhausted. So Ethan winds up having to do it. He pushed his palm against Lindon's core, the one swollen with energy, ready to spill over and advance to iron, and guided the scales Madra within. It flexed, resisting for a second before cracking like a broken dam. The Madra flowed all through Lindon's body, expelling all physical impurities and transforming him with the power of the soul. His core would condense and restore itself into a smaller, denser form, transmuted from copper to iron. Ethan took a quick step back. And this kid winds up oozing black gunk out of his pores. And it is really, really gross. When he winds up coming to, he smells himself and is just like, oh my God. And they wind up taking a fair amount of time washing him down and getting a new set of clothes, because it is just out of the question that he keep wearing that. Like, it's not happening. So this is when we go to Jailong with the Sandviper ritual. The boy's whole family had gathered to see this paragon of their younger generation receive his Sandviper body. Jailong clutched the Sandviper in one hand. With the other, he delicately squeezed the gland around the serpent's fang. A drop of venom welled, and he wicked it off with a needle. So the reason that I say that I'm assuming Lindon is stronger than what Crawl anticipated is because that Viper isn't killed. They give that kid a little tiny, like, thimbleful of blood and a single drop injected of the venom. And that's how this kid advances. The Sandviper isn't even killed in this process. Whereas Lindon is administered 6 in the end Sandvipers worth of venom. All the venom they each held. Like, we hear it described to us in no uncertain terms that these Sandvipers are twisted, broken, emptied shells on the floor after he's done with them. So he drinks all their blood and takes and cycles all their venom. That has to give a vastly different result than what we see happening with this kid right here. And I just love the fact that we get to see this and that the author was like, all right, for perspective, I'm going to show you how this normally goes. So maybe you'll have an inkling what the fuck Lindon just did and how fucking metal that is. Because it is. And when I say it's metal, I did not intend that pun, but now I do. So yeah, a few drops of blood filled the bowl, and Jailong replaced the Sandviper in its cage. I mean, just in comparison, it is almost insulting, you know? So he goes and does this thing. The kid is supposed to, like, you know, bear it without crying or making a scene, and he does and makes his dad proud, yada, yada, yada. And then they get interrupted by Crawl coming in, and he, first of all, does the whole, like, you must be so proud of your son. He's going to be so strong. You can give him a little bit extra. He'll deal with it. And just really laying it on with this family in a very politician-y sort of way. It's like, is it over the top from the outside? Maybe. But when you're on the inside being, like, receiving this sort of attention, it's not, you can't, it's hard to withstand that from somebody that you respect, you know? He'll be the pride of his sect in a few years. I'll do it myself. And I love this. The boy practically shone with pride, which made Jailong wonder why Crawl hadn't just done this whole procedure himself. I wonder about that because I feel like it's pretty obvious why not, right? Like, the reason that he didn't do it himself was so that he could come in here and make this, like, statement of faith that Jailong apparently doesn't have, and apparently he'll be sort of seen as giving this kid extra attention, having more faith in him than other people did, and that will win this kid's loyalty in a way that I don't know would be possible otherwise. This kid will always remember he was the one who allowed me to do more and believed that I could be more. And his family will also always remember that. Jailong, even if he is the one that's, like, de facto in charge of the Sandvipers, is not a Sandviper. And they are all afraid of him. But Crawl needs more than for people to be afraid of him. Crawl needs people to love and respect him, to see him as one of them in a way that Jailong can never be. So he's making that happen. And honestly, I'm a little bummed that it looks like Crawl is dead as fuck by the end of this section, because I was looking forward to seeing what it's like to watch Crawl and Jailong work side by side. Jailong is in a lot of ways the brains and power of the operation. But Kral also has brains. It's just that he uses them in an entirely different direction than Jai does. And so, yeah, I just found it funny that Jailong doesn't seem to understand what happened here. Whereas to me, this seemed pretty, like, staged. You know, it seems like the kind of thing that Kral might pull again, depending on who it is that he's dealing with. He might know something about this kid and feel like it's really important to get him on his side or his family or something. So at this point, Jailong pulls Kral aside and says, the Fishers have gotten us through most of the doors. We think we have a grasp on the rest of the script, but there's still one door between us and the final chamber. I suspect there may be another way. And at this point, they get interrupted by a messenger coming to let them know that the Aurelius family is arriving. And their banner is deep blue and white with a black crescent in the center. He says, gather the Fishers, inform the Jai clan. We're going in now. And Kral asks, what if we can't open the door? And Jailong says, we'll make a new one. And that is where we start off with the next section with Lindon waking up. He gets into a new robe that is bright pink and has like silver flowers embroidered all over it, which I just want to see this so bad. No, not silver, gold. Honestly, this robe sounds like my jam so hard. Anybody who comes to the Crowdcasts knows that like half of the shit in my office is pink and the rest of it is gold or wishes it was. So yeah, I was very saddened to see that Lindon trashes these robes so quickly. He gets showered, so to speak, changes into them, and there's this moment where Ethan hands him the wooden badge, and he says, it doesn't fit me anymore. And he closes his hand and crushes it. And he holds on to the shade silk ribbon and feels this like surge of excitement and is just like, God damn, this happened for me. I can't believe it. So then they get like a notification, so to speak, from Ethan that like, all right, so there are people coming in. We really need to fucking head out. This is getting serious. And there is a perfect test for your new iron body ahead of us. So let's go. And indeed, Lindon has woken up and is totally healed. Everything is fine. You know, legs are fine. Skin is flawless. All of the injuries that he had when he transformed are completely wiped away. And I really like the detail that now his hearing is much better. And as they're making their way through this pyramid, he keeps hearing things in the walls and he's getting really creeped out. And he looks at the two of them to see if they're as creeped out as him, but they're obviously just so used to these sorts of sounds that they don't even notice them anymore. So he winds up in the central chamber where the spear is. And it is such a dope scene because I'm thinking, oh, he's going to grab that spear. No. It turns out that there are some bindings that can be made into the spear and what it does. But he doesn't want the spear itself. He's basically doing do I want someone to give me a fish or do I want somebody to teach me how to fish? And Lindon, with an incredible insight and bit of wisdom here for somebody his age, is like, oh, teach me how to fish, baby. I don't want to take the spear. Somebody else can take that shit. That is nothing compared to figuring out how to do this. Are you kidding? That is the kind of knowledge that people would literally easily kill for. So he takes these, like, they sort of look like screw shaped. I believe they're white. These bindings, which are supposed to pull the Madra out of your enemy. And he was hoping that if that was accomplished, that then the Madra would like just flow directly into you, the one holding the weapon. And we find out pretty quickly as he goes up against Crawl in a little bit, that is not how that works. It was very dangerous, as a matter of fact. This thing gets a bit overloaded, it seems like. I'm not sure that's what happened. If it was an overload, if it's because like Crawl was as advanced as he was, if it's because I don't know if there is something because of this thing not being fully forged the way that it was supposed to be, that it's just like this raw binding rather than a fully made spear, that it doesn't actually complete this task that it's supposedly going to be able to at some point. But he stabs Crawl with it once the rest of the crew begins to file into the central chamber, and it explodes. And if he hadn't let go of it in time, it would have taken his hand off. I love too that I already talked about Crawl stabbing him and walking away. I love that when Crawl throws him at one point, he expects that this kick that he aimed at him that tosses him across the room will have killed him. And it not only does it not, but this is what makes Crawl realize, oh shit, you advanced to iron. Well, damn, like he didn't expect that. I'm a fan of any time an enemy thinks that he has got your number, that he knows what you're working with, and then he finds out that he was super wrong, that he just, especially at the end here, it happens in such an extreme way where, yes, he does wind up figuring out that Lindon is iron, but he still doesn't really understand what that means in Lindon's case specifically. So the last thing he does is underestimate him, and then he's dead. And it is a pretty dramatic moment, like the way this thing explodes. I can't tell if that destroyed the binding. I think it did, but it might have just like exploded like in a way that looked physical, but left the binding whole. Because I think the Madra is a separate thing from the binding, right? So it might have been that the Madra exploded out from it. I can't quite tell. And I had forgotten too, the script that was around the thing. It says he'd seen this before. Lindon says we've seen this before. It looks like the picture in the ancestor's tomb. That's a week away on the 1,000-mile cloud. Well, that's a head scratcher, she said. And she is about to smash this thing with her sword. He's like thinking he's going to tell her to stop. And then he's like, I can't without getting hurt. So I'm going to let her do this. But there's only a chip comes off from the door. Otherwise, it is completely unmarred. And this is when he glances behind him. Without giving himself too much room to think, he picked up his severed remnant part and pointed it at the oncoming rush of beasts. His Madra flowed down the weapon, trickling towards the binding. The big one, Ethan shouted, but through his ringing ears, Lindon heard it as a whisper. The man was standing now, but he was actually leaning his shoulder against one of the wider sections of wall, completely at his ease. So he thrusts this stinger and activates the binding. He used his weaker core, the copper one, because it was just barely strong enough to fuel the weapon. The activation drew his core dry, and if that had been his only source of Madra, he would have collapsed immediately. But he pulled on his iron core instantly, keeping his legs steady even as the binding activated. 3 hazy green duplicates like less real copies of the stinger flickered into existence around his thrust. It was as though he drove 4 spears instead of 1, which is what he winds up doing to Crawl later. Now, I have asked, and I don't remember if I got an answer. If I did, I think I just didn't internalize it enough to remember it. How does the leveling up deal with his cores? Because he mentions at one point the weak core versus the copper core. But here it says his weaker core, he talks before when he advances to copper about how the copper core is more advanced than his other core. I assumed that if he did like advance to iron, it would have to be from the copper core. But it seems like he was able to advance from the blank core. So now he has a copper and an iron core. And I don't really understand how that works. Like, I just don't really get that. So if anybody feels like explaining that to me, I don't have time right now to like get into it because I'm almost out of time. I am out of time. But I just thought I would put that out there as a question in case there's something that I have missed about this. So yeah, this is like the way that he first uses this ability here with this creature. And then he winds up going up against Krull with it. And when Krull dies, Jai Long is so angry. Like, it's a combo, I think, that he's devastated and angry because he turns and looks at him with this expression that Lindon is just like, oh, shit. And I can only imagine what it must look like for somebody of that advancement to have been killed by an iron who had just been a copper, like, a couple days ago. That is really embarrassing. And that is going to look really bad for the Sandvipers, I would imagine, unless they are able to hush this up somehow. I just think that's going to lose them some serious face. So we'll see how that goes. So I'm trying to see if there's anything else that I wanted to mention here before I wrapped up. Let's see. The weapon, a spear formed seamlessly from Madra by ancient soulsmiths. It shone with the light of the stars, congealed into a weapon whose power he could feel radiating against his skin. And I love this too, because honestly, as much as I knew that this like spear was on the table, I knew that there was a possibility that he could take it in a hypothetical sense, but it just did not feel to me like something that Lindon would be interested in, getting this super high powered weapon. It just didn't feel like Lindon. And when he comes across it, I was like, all right, I'm not going to be mad if he gets it. But it also feels like it's not like this is going to give him a power that is so external, that is going to be so dependent on the thing that he's holding in his hand. And I feel like everything has been about his personal drive and what's in him versus trying to take something that will like rep for him on the outside. And I was so delighted that he decided to take these pieces that will help him learn how to make it versus just taking the item itself. And also that means that people aren't just going to be pursuing him for this weapon. Maybe it will, like, you know, once we end this section, this chapter ends with them still in this area of the pyramid, and the spear is still very much on the table as something that he could potentially take. But as of right now, I am all about him choosing to leave it behind and let somebody else have it if they want it, because he's doing something he's just thinking a lot bigger picture and a lot further ahead. The last thing I wanted to mention are the badges that he finds, because this is a Soulsmith's forge, and the badges that are like in this container here go beyond what he has ever seen. The first row contained a badge of copper, iron, jade, and gold. That much he expected. But the second row moved from half silver to gold steel to materials he couldn't identify. One of them was a deep fiery red and the other a blue so rich it was like a forged slice of the sky. And he goes and takes the iron badge and puts it on. And Ethan is kind of like, oh, damn, look at you. And I hope that he takes the rest of them with him and switches up as he begins to advance. I know it doesn't matter really, but as somebody who does like getting like sort of mementos of achievements, it would really be something I would want to get actual physical representation that I have moved up, you know? So yeah, I hope that he walks out of there with that box of them. Fingers crossed. So that is where we end, is him having gone up against Krull. It is really like incredibly satisfying in the one sense, but also like so frightening in another to know the anthill that he has stepped in here. And I can't wait to see what Jailong does, because I'm sure he wouldn't ordinarily be willing to challenge him, but he just killed Crawl, you know? So whether this kid's just an iron or not, it's apparent that he can stand up to a gold of some level. Maybe he'll go up against him anyway. I don't know. Or maybe he'll try to recruit him. Crawl tries to recruit Ethan in this section. So maybe that's what he'll do, but I don't think so. I don't think he'll be able to do that, set that aside. I think he liked Crawl too much. All right, I'm well over time here, so I really have to go. But thank you very much again to Andy for commissioning this episode. And I hope that you are enjoying it. I can't believe that this next section is the last one for this book. What? And then we're going to be moving on to the next one, whose title I haven't checked on yet. But I'm pretty excited about it. So I hope that you guys are enjoying, and I'll be seeing you again on Friday with the last episode of Soulsmith. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.